The smell of dried blood mixed with old hay was the first thing Thomas Miller smelled as he pushed open the creaking barn door in the early hours of June 1947. The rancher had rushed out of the main house, woken by the desperate barking of Thunder, his German shepherd who never barked without a reason. The lantern shook in his trembling hand as his eyes adjusted to the darkness of the wooden shed. The cold wind from the ridge blew through the cracks, carrying with it the heavy silence of the night. It was then that he saw her. In the darkest corner of the barn, tied to one of the support beams with a thick sisal rope, was Helen Carter. The blue floral dress she had worn to the county fair 3 nights ago now hung in tatters on her thin body. Her slender arms showed purple bruises from fingers, her wrists were raw from the friction of the rope, and her delicate face was swollen, with a deep cut above her left eyebrow. But it was her eyes that gave Thomas Miller a tightness in his chest that he had been trying to forget for 15 years. Those brown eyes, usually sweet and shy, were completely empty. There were no tears. There was no fear. There was nothing. It was the look of someone who had died on the inside while their body stubbornly kept breathing. Thomas dropped the lantern on the dirt floor and ran to the girl. His calloused farmer's hands shook as he untied the knots. Helen didn't react. She didn't scream. She didn't move. She didn't blink. When she was finally free, her body simply slumped forward, and the rancher caught her in his arms with care, like someone holding something sacred and broken at the same time. The news spread through the town of St. Anthony's Valley before the sun had even fully risen. Thomas had sent his foreman, Jeb, to fetch Dr. Cassidy in a hurry, but the doctor brought more than just his black leather bag. He brought Mrs. Higgins, the town's respected midwife and herbalist, and unintentionally, he also brought the curious stares and sharp tongues of half a dozen women who just happened to be passing by at that exact moment. When Mrs. Higgins examined Helen in the guest room of the main house, which Thomas had prepared in a rush, her wrinkled face closed in an expression of contained pain and rage. Dr. Cassidy merely shook his head and murmured something about calling the sheriff. But everyone knew Sheriff Reynolds was a weak man, more concerned with not upsetting the powerful men of the region than with doing real justice. Helen remained in absolute silence. She let herself be washed, let herself be dressed in a clean nightgown, let herself be medicated, but she didn't make a single sound. Her eyes remained fixed on some distant point that only she could see. Mrs. Higgins said a strong prayer, burned some sage, but when she left the room, her own hands were trembling. In the farmhouse's large kitchen, while Thomas brewed coffee on the wood stove, the old woman spoke softly. "The body heals, Mr. Miller, but that girl's soul has been shattered. Whoever did this to her isn't human. It's the devil in the shape of a man." The rancher didn't answer. He just poured the boiling coffee into a tin mug and drank it in long gulps, feeling the bitter liquid burn his throat. He knew that kind of pain well. He knew it too well. But what was to come would be even worse than the crime itself. The next morning, Helen Carter's home, a simple 2-room shack at the edge of town, was surrounded by people. The girl's mother, Ida, a frail woman with hair already white and hands destroyed from washing other people's clothes, wept copiously on her neighbor's shoulder while repeating between sobs, "My girl, my innocent girl, who did this to my girl?" Helen's older brothers, Anthony and John, rough men who worked at the sawmill, were deranged with rage. They wanted blood. They wanted justice. They wanted a name to direct the hatred growing in their chests. But Helen wouldn't speak, and in the absence of words, the town's cruel imagination began to work. It was Mrs. Gable, the owner of the general store in the town square, who started the poison. While weighing beans for a customer, she commented loud enough for half a dozen people to hear. "I always thought that Helen was a bit odd, you know? Very quiet, kept to herself. A girl from a poor family, but acting high and mighty. And now she shows up like that, tied up in Thomas Miller's barn." Miller's barn, folks. Do you think this story is what it seems? The seed was planted. At the barbershop, while trimming beards, the subject was the same. Thomas has been a widower for 15 years. A man alone on that big ranch, just with the hands. Suddenly, he shows up with the girl in there. Don't you find that strange? At Sunday service, the whispers were as loud as the prayers. Father Eugene, an old man in a worn cassock, asked for compassion and prayer for the girl. But when Helen didn't appear at church, and wouldn't for weeks, the murmuring gained strength. A decent girl goes to church even if she's hurt. A girl who doesn't go, well, maybe she's ashamed of what she did. The transformation was fast and brutal. In a matter of days, Helen Carter went from being the victim of a heinous crime to becoming, in the eyes of the town, a girl of questionable morals who got into something wrong and brought disgrace to her own family. Women averted their gaze when they crossed paths with Ida on the street. Men made dirty jokes at the tavern. And Helen, trapped in the silence that protected her and condemned her at the same time, remained at Thomas Miller's ranch, oblivious to the judgment growing outside like a plague. Thomas felt the pressure rising. At the market, when he went to buy supplies, the clerk was cold. At church, Mrs. Margaret, one of the most influential church ladies, ostentatiously turned her face away when he passed. Even Jeb, his faithful foreman of 20 years, had the courage to ask, "Boss, are you sure about what you're doing?" Folks are saying all sorts of things. The rancher looked deep into his employee's eyes and replied with a steady voice, "I know exactly what I'm doing, Jeb. And if anyone asks, you tell them Helen Carter is under my protection. And anyone who messes with her messes with me." But there was something Thomas wasn't telling anyone. Every night, after the house fell silent, he climbed up to the dusty attic of the farmhouse. There, inside a cedar wood box, he kept a letter. The letter was yellowed with time, the ink half faded, but the words were still legible. He didn't need to open it to know what was written. He knew every line by heart, every comma, every desperate plea that was never answered in time. The letter was from his wife, Amelia. Amelia Miller had died 15 years ago, in 1932, and Thomas had carried a guilt ever since that not even 1,000 lives could erase. When he looked at Helen, when he saw those empty eyes and that tomb-like silence, it was as if he were looking at Amelia again, as if God were giving him a second chance to do the right thing, a chance to protect the one he failed to protect before. But the town didn't understand, and they didn't want to understand. A week after being found, Helen finally came out of her room. It was mid-afternoon, the winter sun coming through the large windows of the living room, and Thomas was sitting in his leather armchair reading the newspaper from the state capitol when he heard barefoot steps on the wooden floor. He looked up and saw her standing in the doorway, too thin inside the white nightgown Mrs. Higgins had brought, her dark hair falling loose over her shoulders, the marks on her face already starting to heal, but her eyes still carrying that emptiness. Thomas said nothing. He just gestured to the empty chair by the window. Helen walked slowly, as if relearning how to use her own legs, and sat down. They stayed there, in silence, just existing in the same space. The rancher noticed her hands trembling slightly in her lap. After long minutes, he spoke softly. "You don't have to tell me anything, Helen. You don't have to talk if you don't want to. But you need to know that you're safe here. No one will lay a finger on you as long as I have breath in my body." She didn't answer, but a single tear rolled down her pale face. It was the first tear in a week. The days passed with a strange routine. Helen began to move around the house, always silent, always observing. She helped in the kitchen when Mrs. Mary, the ranch cook, prepared meals. She sat on the porch in the late afternoons to watch the sunset behind the mountains. Gradually, there were small signs that she was still alive inside, even if her mouth remained closed. Thomas kept a respectful distance, but was always nearby. He never touched her without warning. He never raised his voice. He never made sudden movements. He treated Helen as if she were made of the thinnest glass, because deep down, that was exactly what she was in that moment. But outside, the storm was thickening. Mrs. Margaret and other church ladies organized a morality committee and scheduled a visit to the ranch. They appeared on a Saturday afternoon. 4 women in black, with rosaries in their hands and moral superiority in their eyes. Thomas received them on the veranda, refusing to let them enter. "Mr. Miller," began Mrs. Margaret with a shrill voice, "we came here representing the good families of St. Anthony's Valley. It isn't right for a single man to keep a young woman in his house. It is a sin and a scandal. The girl needs to go back to her family." The rancher crossed his arms over his broad chest and replied in a voice that admitted no argument. "The girl was found tied up and beaten in my barn. Someone used my property to commit an atrocity. Until I find out who it was, Helen stays here, where I can protect her. And if you and the others have so much zeal for morality, you should be hunting the scoundrel who did that, not persecuting the victim." Mrs. Margaret turned red. "But Mr. Miller, people talk. They say she isn't a decent girl, that she got involved with a married man, that people speak what the mouth wants and the brain doesn't think." Thomas's voice came out hard as stone. "And if I hear one more word against Helen Carter, from anyone, I'm going to have a very serious conversation with the speaker. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." He went inside and closed the door in their faces. Inside the house, hidden behind the living room curtain, Helen had watched everything. And for the first time in 2 weeks, something resembling gratitude passed through those empty eyes. That night, Thomas went up to the attic again. He took Amelia's letter and read it once more by the light of the lantern. The words seemed to pulse on the yellowed page. "Thomas, please, believe me. He said if I told anyone, he would kill you. I can't let that happen, but I can't take it anymore. I can't take the stairs. I can't take the lies. I can't take the weight of carrying this alone. If you are reading this, it is because I wasn't strong enough. Forgive me." He closed his eyes tight, feeling the old pain pulse like a fresh wound. Amelia had hanged herself in the ranch barn 15 years ago, the same barn where Helen was found. And just like Helen, Amelia had also been violated. But back then, Thomas didn't believe her. He believed the town gossip. He believed when they said his wife was making up stories to hide an affair. He believed everyone, except her. When he found the body, it was already too late. And the letter, hidden under the mattress, revealed the truth that destroyed him. Amelia had been raped repeatedly by someone who threatened her with death. And she had chosen to die because she could no longer bear the weight of the secret and the poison of judgment. Thomas never discovered who it was. Amelia hadn't left the name in the letter, but from that day on, He swore that if he ever had the chance to protect another woman from the same pain, he would do it differently. He would do it right. Helen was that chance. He put the letter back in the box and went down the creaking stairs. The house was dark, barely lit by the weak light of the hallway lamp. But as he passed the slightly open door of the guest room, Thomas stopped. He could hear a very low sound coming from inside. A muffled cry, a broken sob of someone finally allowing the pain to come out. He didn't go in. He just stood there in the hallway, hand on the cold wall, listening to Helen cry. And as he listened, his own silent tears ran down the aged face of the rancher who carried 15 years of remorse. The next morning, something changed. Helen appeared in the kitchen before the coffee was ready, and for the first time, spoke. Her voice came out hoarse, scratched from disuse, but firm. "Good morning, Mr. Miller." The rancher, who was pouring boiling water into the coffee pot, almost dropped the kettle. He turned slowly and saw Helen there, standing, arms crossed over her body as if trying to protect herself, but with her eyes finally present. Still in pain, still scared, but present. "Good morning, child," he smiled, and it was a genuine smile. "Want some coffee?" She nodded and sat at the large solid wood table. Thomas poured 2 mugs, put out bread with butter and a slice of cornbread Mrs. Mary had made the day before. He sat on the other side of the table, keeping his distance, and they drank coffee in silence. But it was a different silence now. It wasn't the silence of pure trauma anymore. It was the silence of 2 people who understood each other without needing to explain. After a few sips, Helen spoke again, her voice still fragile. "Why are you doing this? Why are you helping me?" Thomas looked deep into those brown eyes and thought about lying. Thought about giving a simple and comfortable answer. But he decided Helen deserved the truth, at least part of it. "Because I already made the mistake of not believing someone when they needed it. And that person died, carrying the pain alone." He paused, his voice getting gruffer. "I won't make the same mistake twice." Helen stared at him for long seconds. There were many questions in that look, but she didn't ask any. She just murmured, "Thank you." And Thomas knew, in that instant, that Helen's journey back to life had begun. It would be long, it would be painful, but it had begun. What he didn't know yet was that things were about to get much worse before they got better. Because out there, in the shadows of St. Anthony's Valley, the man who had tied Helen in that barn was watching, and he wasn't at all pleased to know the girl was still alive. Worse still, she was under the protection of the most respected rancher in the region. He would need to act, and soon. 3 days after that first conversation, Helen was on the ranch porch sewing a patch onto a tablecloth when she saw a carriage coming up the dirt road. Her heart raced. She recognized the carriage. It belonged to Colonel Augustus Fletcher, the most powerful man in St. Anthony's Valley, owner of 3 ranches, the sawmill, half the arable land, and the bought loyalty of Sheriff Reynolds. Helen dropped her sewing and ran into the house. She found Thomas in his study and managed only to whisper, voice trembling, "He's coming." Thomas frowned. "Who?" "Colonel Augustus." The rancher stood up immediately, a dark expression crossing his face. "You stay in here. Lock the bedroom door. Don't come out until I call you." Helen obeyed without question, but something in the way Thomas spoke, in the tension that took over his body, made her stomach turn with fear. Thomas went out to the veranda and stood there, waiting. The carriage stopped in front of the house, and Colonel Augustus Fletcher stepped down with the arrogance of a man who owned the world. He was a tall man, strong despite being in his 50s, with a thick mustache and light eyes that deceived with their cordial appearance. He wore a dark suit even in the heat and carried a silver-handled cane, more for show than necessity. Thomas, my friend. His voice was booming, rehearsed. I came to pay a visit to a neighbor. Colonel. Thomas didn't walk down the veranda steps. He didn't offer coffee. He made no gesture of cordiality. What brings you here? Augustus walked up the steps slowly, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I heard you're hosting the Carter girl, that Helen. I came to offer help. What kind of help? Well, you're a single man, Thomas. It doesn't look right. People talk. And you know how I value the morals and good customs of our town. He made a theatrical pause. I have a proposal. I can give Helen a job at my house, in the kitchen. My wife, Mrs. Felicia, needs help, and it would be a Christian charity to give the girl work after the misfortune that happened. Thomas felt every muscle in his body go tense. There was something wrong with that proposal. Something very wrong. The way the colonel said Helen's name, the shine in his eyes, the insistence. I appreciate the offer, but Helen stays here. She is recovering. Augustus's smile faltered. Thomas, be reasonable. The girl needs to work, needs to rebuild her reputation. Staying here only makes the situation worse. Leave it to me. I'll take care of it. I said no. Thomas's voice came out hard as granite. The silence that settled was heavy. Colonel Augustus squared his shoulders, and all false cordiality evaporated from his face. You're making a mistake, Thomas. A big mistake. In this town, either you're with me or you're against me. And you know what happens to those who are against me. Is that a threat? It's advice from a friend. Augustus took a step forward, bringing his face close. That girl isn't worth it. She's nobody. A washerwoman's daughter. No name, no future. Why are you risking your reputation for her? Thomas looked deep into those cold, light eyes, and suddenly, with terrifying clarity, he knew. He had no proof. He had nothing concrete. But his instinct, honed by 52 years of life, screamed the truth. It was you. Augustus blinked. What? It was you who tied her in the barn. It was you who hurt Helen. The colonel stepped back. Genuine surprise stamped on his face for a split second before being replaced by a forced laugh. Have you lost your mind, Thomas? You're accusing a good man, married, a father of... Get off my property, now. Augustus stopped laughing. The mask fell completely, and what remained was pure malice. You're going to regret this, Thomas Miller. You can be sure of that. He walked down the steps with heavy strides, and before getting into the carriage, turned one last time. And when you come begging for my forgiveness, it will be too late, for you and for the girl. The carriage left, kicking up dust from the road, and Thomas stood there, heart beating fast, the certainty growing in his chest. It was Augustus. It had to be. Maybe it was him who, Amelia. His dead wife's name exploded in his mind like lightning. What if it had been Augustus with Amelia too? What if the secret she took to the grave was the name of the most powerful colonel in the region? A man no one dared to defy. A man who bought silence and destroyed those who opposed him. Thomas stumbled into the house and went straight to the study. He locked the door, opened the desk drawer, and took out the .38 caliber revolver he kept there. He checked the bullets. All in the chamber. His hands weren't trembling anymore. There was a strange calm taking over him. The calm of someone who finally understood the size of the battle ahead. A soft knock on the door made him look up. Mr. Miller? It was Helen's voice, quiet, scared. Is he gone? Thomas put the gun away quickly and opened the door. Helen was pale, eyes wide. He's gone. Did he ask about me? He did, but I told him you're staying here. Thomas put his hands on her shoulders, forcing the girl to look at him. Helen, I need you to answer me one thing. and I need you to be honest with me. Was it him? Was it Colonel Augustus who did that to you?" Helen's eyes filled with tears instantly. Her whole body began to shake. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. She just nodded her head, once, twice, 3 times, and then she crumbled. Thomas held her while she cried, violent sobs shaking her thin body. And in that moment, everything was confirmed. The rage he felt was a living thing burning inside. But stronger than the rage was the determination. Colonel Augustus Fletcher had destroyed 2 women Thomas loved. He had killed Amelia with his bought silence and his threats, and he had tried to break Helen the same way. But this time would be different. This time, Thomas had a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. War was declared. What Thomas Miller didn't know yet was that the yellowed letter kept in the attic contained more than Amelia's confession. It contained a clue, a name, a place, and that clue, when it finally came to light, would change everything. It would reveal not just the extent of Augustus Fletcher's evil, but also an impossible connection between the past and the present, between Amelia and Helen, a blood connection that not even Thomas imagined. And when the truth finally exploded, St. Anthony's Valley would never be the same again. Helen stayed at Thomas's ranch under the silent protection of the rancher, but the whole town seemed to have declared war against them. In the days following Colonel Augustus's threatening visit, the siege began to tighten in subtle and cruel ways. The supplier who always delivered to Thomas's ranch sent word he could no longer provide service. The washerwoman who picked up clothes every week simply stopped showing up. Even Father Eugene, in a cowardly demonstration of where his true loyalty lay, sent a letter asking Thomas to reconsider the delicate situation and think of the good of the community. But Thomas Miller was not a man to back down. He started going into town personally to do the shopping, facing the sideways glances and malicious whispers. Jeb, the faithful foreman, also remained by his boss's side, even though his wife had begged him to quit before all that mess splashed onto the family. Helen, for her part, began to slowly wake from the nightmare. The mornings were still hard. She would wake up startled, heart racing, memories of that night in the barn returning in sharp fragments. The smell of hay still made her feel nauseous. The sound of a rope dragging made her freeze. But there was something different now. There was Thomas. There was someone who believed her. One July afternoon, while the chill from the ridge tightened and the sky turned gray with approaching rain, Helen was in the kitchen helping Mrs. Mary peel potatoes when she heard raised voices coming from the living room. She recognized Thomas's voice and another male voice, younger, equally angry. She dropped the knife and walked silently to the kitchen door to listen. "I just came to get my sister, Mr. Miller. My mother is sick from crying so much. The folks in town won't leave us alone. I need to take Helen home." It was Anthony, Helen's older brother, a strong man with big hands from working at the sawmill, face sunburnt, and eyes carrying anger and frustration. Thomas kept his voice calm but firm. "Anthony, I understand your pain, but Helen is safe here. In town, the man who did that to her walks free, and if she goes back, and you think it's safer here?" Anthony took a step forward, finger pointing. "You're putting my sister in a worse situation. Everyone says she's your mistress, that you took advantage of her, that—" "Enough." Helen's voice cut through the air like a blade. The 2 men turned around, startled. She was standing in the living room doorway, thin, pale, but with her chin raised in a show of courage that cost every ounce of strength she had left. Anthony's eyes went wide, seeing his sister. They hadn't seen each other in weeks, and the transformation was shocking. Helen looked like she had aged years in a matter of days. Helen, her brother's voice faltered. Sis! She walked slowly until she was facing him. I'm not going back, Anthony. Not now. Here I can breathe without feeling like I'm being judged every second. Mr. Miller hasn't laid a finger on me. He saved me. And if the town wants to believe lies, that's their problem. Anthony ran a hand through his hair, desperate. But Mom, Helen, Mom is... I know. Helen's eyes filled with tears. I know she's suffering, and I'll visit her. But I won't live there again. Not with him loose out there. Who is he? Anthony took a step forward, grabbing his sister's shoulders. Tell me who it was, and I'll end the bastard. Me and John, we'll take justice into our own hands. Helen looked at her brother, and Thomas saw the terror returning to her eyes. You can't do anything, Anthony. He's too powerful. He'll destroy you. He'll destroy Mom. He'll destroy everyone. Who? Anthony practically screamed. Who, Helen? But she just shook her head and stepped back, arms crossing over her body, in that gesture of protection that was already familiar. Thomas stepped forward and put a hand on Anthony's shoulder, firm but not aggressive. Anthony, when your sister is ready, she will speak, but forcing her won't help. And if you go out there wanting vigilante justice without proof, you'll end up in jail or dead, and then your mother suffers more. Leave Helen here a while longer. Let her recover. Anthony looked from the rancher to his sister, eyes red with held-back tears. I just wanted to protect you, sis. I promised Dad before he died I'd take care of you. Helen approached and hugged her brother, allowing herself to cry on his broad shoulder. You protect me by believing me. That alone is a lot. Anthony left with the promise that he would return on Sunday with their mother for a visit. When his carriage disappeared down the dirt road, Helen collapsed into a living room chair, trembling. Thomas poured a glass of water and sat in the armchair opposite, keeping a respectful distance. You were very brave today. Helen gave a bitter laugh. Brave? I'm dying of fear, Mr. Miller. Fear that he finds out I spoke. Fear that he comes back. Fear of sleeping and waking up tied again. He won't get you again. I won't let him. You can't watch me every second of every day. She looked at the rancher with a mix of gratitude and desperation. And he has the power to do whatever he wants. The sheriff works for him. The judge is his friend. Half the town owes him money. How do we fight against that? Thomas fell silent for a long moment. Then he stood up, went to the bookshelf, and came back bringing a small wooden box. He sat down again and placed the box on the coffee table between them. I need to tell you a story, Helen. A story few know, and that I've never truly told anyone. He took a deep breath. 15 years ago, I was married. My wife's name was Amelia. She was the most precious thing I had in life. Helen leaned forward, attentive. Amelia started to change one day. She got quiet, sad, pulled away from me. I didn't understand. I thought it was sickness, sent for the doctor, but she said everything was fine. Until one day she came to me, crying, and said a man had forced himself on her. Said she had been threatened with death if she told anyone. Thomas's voice became rougher, the words hard to get out. I didn't believe her, Helen. God forgive me, but I didn't believe her. The folks in town were already talking that she was having an affair, that she'd been seen talking to a man near the river. And I, coward that I was, believed the gossip instead of believing my own wife. Helen put a hand over her mouth, eyes wide. Amelia killed herself 3 weeks later, hanged herself in the barn. The same barn where you were found. A tear rolled down the rancher's aged face. And she left a letter telling me everything, begging me to believe her, forgiving me for not believing before. He opened the box slowly and took out the yellowed paper, extending it to Helen. She didn't leave the man's name. She was afraid I'd get myself killed trying to avenge her. but I always suspected who it was. And when Colonel Augustus showed up here the other day, when I saw the way he said your name, I knew for sure." Helen took the letter with trembling hands and read. Amelia Miller's words seemed to jump off the paper, raw pain printed in faded ink. When she finished, tears were running freely down her face. "That's why you're helping me. Because you couldn't help her. It's more than that." Thomas took Helen's hand, the first time he touched her deliberately. "It's because I know what it is to carry the guilt of not doing the right thing, and I won't let that happen again. Augustus already destroyed a woman I loved. He won't destroy another." Helen squeezed the rancher's hand, and in that moment, an alliance was formed that went beyond protection. It was a partnership of two wounded souls who recognized each other in the other's pain. She wasn't just a victim under his care anymore. She was someone worth fighting for. In the days that followed, a strange but comforting routine was established. Helen started helping more around the house, not because she had to, but because staying busy helped keep the demons at bay. She mended Thomas's clothes, helped Mrs. Mary in the kitchen, tended the chickens in the yard. Small acts of normality that slowly reassembled the person she had been. Thomas, for his part, began to teach Helen to read better. She knew the basics, but he brought books from the library he kept in the study. They sat together on winter evenings, near the fireplace, and she read aloud while he fixed harnesses or organized papers. There was nothing inappropriate. It was just company. Two solitudes sharing the same space. One evening, Helen was reading a short story when she stopped in the middle of a sentence and looked at Thomas. "Can I ask a question?" "You can. Why did you never remarry? It's been 15 years. Thomas put down the harness he was fixing and stared at the fire in the hearth. "Because I didn't deserve to be happy again. I thought it was my punishment, living alone, without joy, carrying the weight of what I did." "But you didn't do anything. It was the man who hurt her. It was the town that judged her. You just made a mistake." "I made a mistake at the most important moment, when she needed me most." He turned to Helen. "And you? Was there someone before that happened?" Helen blushed slightly. "There was a boy, Joe, the blacksmith's helper. We used to talk at my mother's gate sometimes. He was kind, but after that, he won't even look at me. Crosses the street when he sees me. Then he wasn't a real man. A real man doesn't abandon who he says he cares for at the first sign of trouble." "You speak nicely, Mr. Miller, but the world isn't like that. The world is cruel to a hurt woman. We turn into something dirty. No one wants us anymore. I want you." The words came out before Thomas could think better. Helen's eyes went wide, startled, and he hurried to explain. "I mean, I want you to stay here, not as a maid, not as a favor, but as someone who has a place here, someone who belongs here." Helen fell silent, eyes fixed on the open book in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was tiny. "People will talk even more. Let them talk. I stopped caring what this town thinks. I don't know if I can be that brave. You already are, Helen. You're here, still standing, after what you went through. If that isn't courage, I don't know what is." That night, for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Helen slept without waking up screaming. And Thomas, in the next room, also slept in peace for the first time in 15 years. But the calm wouldn't last. The following Sunday, as promised, Anthony appeared at the ranch bringing their mother. Ida was a small woman, bent by years of hard labor. Her hair completely white, tied in a tight bun. Eyes swollen from so much crying. When she saw Helen on the porch, she dropped her cane and ran with an agility her age didn't suggest. My daughter, my darling daughter." They hugged and cried together, a weeping of mixed relief and pain. Thomas and Anthony stood at a distance, giving space for the moment. Ida held Helen's face between her calloused hands and examined her as if checking every detail. "Are you okay? Are you eating right? Is this man treating you well?" "I am, Mom. Mr. Miller he is good. He saved me." Ida looked at the rancher with eyes full of tears and gratitude. She walked up to him and took his hand with surprising strength. "God bless you, Mr. Miller. You are doing what my sons couldn't. You're protecting my girl." Anthony looked ashamed at the comment but didn't argue. Deep down, he knew it was true. They spent the whole afternoon together. Mrs. Mary prepared a hearty lunch, and for the first time in weeks, Helen laughed. It was a small laugh, because of a silly story Anthony told about John trying to impress a girl in town and falling into the town square fountain. But it was such a beautiful sound that Thomas felt his chest warm up. But the afternoon wouldn't end well. When Ida and Anthony were getting ready to leave, a group of men on horseback appeared on the road. There were 5 riders, all armed, led by Colonel Augustus's son, a young man of about 20 named Matthew Fletcher. He was the opposite of his father in looks, thin, with straight black hair and dark eyes, but he had the same cruelty in his gaze. Thomas stepped forward, placing himself between the riders and his house. "What do you want here?" Matthew smiled, but it was a snake smile. "My father sent a message, Mr. Miller. Said you have 1 week to send the girl away. If you don't send her, he's gonna have to take measures. And you know how my father takes measures. You can tell your father that Helen Carter stays here as long as she wants. And if he or you set foot on my property again uninvited, you'll leave here with lead in your bodies." The riders exchanged glances. One of them, a fat man with a red beard, laughed. "The old man thinks he's tough." Thomas didn't answer. He just kept his eyes fixed on Matthew. The young man held the stare for a few seconds, then spat on the ground. "You've been warned. What happens next is your fault." He pulled the horse's reins and the group left, kicking up dust. Anthony was pale. "Mr. Miller, those people are dangerous. Colonel Augustus has had legs broken over money debts. He set fire to the houses of people who disobeyed. You can't... I know exactly who he is and what he's capable of." Thomas looked at Helen, who was frozen with fear on the porch. "And for that very reason, I won't back down." Ida approached the rancher, voice trembling. "Mr. Miller, I appreciate everything you're doing, but I can't let you die because of my daughter. Maybe it's best if she leaves. Maybe we need to run, go to another town." "And start all over again, with him loose, unpunished, free to do this to another girl?" Thomas shook his head. "No, Ida, this ends here, one way or another." When the mother and brother left, the house was heavy with tension. Helen barely touched her dinner. She sat at the table, pushing the beans around her plate with her fork, eyes distant. "He's going to kill you," she said suddenly, voice void of emotion. "Colonel Augustus is going to kill you because of me. No one is going to die. How can you be so sure?" Thomas got up and went to the shelf. He took something hidden behind the books and came back. It was an old shotgun, but well maintained. "Because I won't die without a fight. And because I have something he doesn't." "What?" "The truth." He placed the weapon on the table. "And the truth always wins in the end. It might take time, but it wins." Helen looked at the shotgun, and then at the man who had become her only protection in this cruel world. "I'm scared, Mr. Miller. Scared he'll do to you what he did to me, or worse." Thomas knelt beside her chair, getting to Helen's eye level. "Listen here. I lived 15 years in fear. Fear of facing the truth. Fear of seeking justice for Amelia. And that fear turned me into a ghost. into a man dead inside. But you brought me back, Helen. You gave me a reason to fight again. So no, I won't let fear win one more time. She placed a hand on his face, a gesture of tenderness that surprised them both. I don't want to lose you. You won't lose me. But even as he said it, Thomas knew the battle approaching would be the hardest of his life. Colonel Augustus Fletcher was not a man to accept insults, and when powerful men felt threatened, there was no limit to the destruction they could cause. What Thomas didn't imagine was that the colonel's response would come much faster than he expected, and it would come in a form he could never predict. 3 nights later, Helen woke up to the smell of smoke. She sat up in bed, heart already racing, instinct screaming danger. She ran to the window, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The barn was on fire. Huge flames illuminated the dark night, and she could hear the horses neighing desperately inside. Mr. Miller! She ran barefoot down the hall, banging on the rancher's door. Fire! The barn is on fire! Thomas woke instantly, already dressing as he ran. They stumbled down the stairs, and when they got outside, the heat was suffocating. Jeb and the other hands were already there, desperately trying to open the barn doors to save the animals, but the chains were locked from the outside. They broke the padlock and put on another. Jeb shouted over the roar of the flames. I can't open it! Thomas grabbed an axe and started hacking at the door's wood, but it was taking too long. Helen heard the animals' cries of pain and didn't think twice. She ran to the back of the barn, where she knew there was a small opening, a hatch used to throw in hay. She crawled through, going straight into hell. Helen, no! Thomas screamed, but it was too late. Inside the barn, the smoke was thick, the heat unbearable. Helen covered her nose and mouth with the hem of her nightgown and crawled along the floor where the air was a little better. She managed to reach the horses. 3 of them, mad with terror, trapped in their stalls. With trembling fingers, she opened the latches. The animals bolted in panic, almost trampling her in the race for the exit that Thomas had managed to hack open. But when Helen tried to leave too, a burning beam fell right in front of her, blocking the path. She stepped back, coughing violently, eyes burning. The world began to spin. Her knees went weak. It was then that strong arms grabbed her. Thomas had run in, ignoring the flames, ignoring the danger, ignoring everything except the need to get Helen out of there. He carried her in his arms, shielding her body with his own, and ran through the fire until he managed to get out through the destroyed door. They collapsed on the ground, coughing, covered in soot. Jed threw water on them to put out the embers that had stuck to their clothes. Helen looked at Thomas and saw he had burns on his arms, blisters starting to form on the skin. You're hurt. It's nothing. He was looking at the barn, which was now collapsing in flames. The same barn where Amelia died. The same barn where Helen was found, burning until nothing was left. It was then that Thomas noticed. At the entrance to the property, still visible in the light of the flames, a horse stood still, and mounted on it, watching the destruction, was Colonel Augustus Fletcher. He didn't even try to hide. He wanted Thomas to know who it was. It was a warning. It was a declaration of war. The 2 men's eyes met across the distance and the smoke. Augustus raised a hand in a gesture of farewell, almost courteous, and then turned his horse and left into the darkness. Thomas tried to get up to go after him, but Helen held him back. No. He wants that. He wants you to go alone into the dark. It's a trap. She was right, and Thomas knew it. But the rage burned stronger than the embers around them. In that moment, watching his barn turn to ash, watching Helen covered in soot and blood from coughing so much, Thomas Miller made a decision. It didn't matter what it cost. It didn't matter what he needed to do. Colonel Augustus Fletcher was going to pay for everything he had done, and Amelia's letter, burned along with the barn, wouldn't be necessary anymore, because Thomas was going to get something better. He was going to get Helen to talk, and when she talked, when she told everything publicly, there wouldn't be enough money or power to save Augustus. The truth was about to explode, and St. Anthony's Valley was going to have to choose: stand with the powerful or stand with what was right. Dawn arrived, gray and cold, over the smoking rubble of the barn. Helen hadn't slept. She had stayed sitting on the porch of the main house, wrapped in a blanket, watching the last embers die, while the sun stubbornly tried to rise behind the mountains. Thomas was beside her, his arms bandaged by Mrs. Mary, who had spent the night tending to the burns. Neither of them spoke. There were no words for the fury they shared. Jeb approached with the other hands, all with somber faces. "Boss, the horses are fine. Scared, but alive. But the barn, nothing's left. And we found this stuck on the fence." He held out a piece of black cloth. Thomas took it and examined it. It was part of a fine, expensive shirt, the kind only rich men wore, and embroidered on it, in almost invisible gold thread, were the initials AF. Augustus Fletcher wasn't even trying to hide. "He wants me to come after him," Thomas muttered, voice dangerously calm. "He wants me to lose my head and do something stupid." "And you ain't gonna fall for that, are you, boss?" asked Jeb, worried. Thomas looked at Helen. She was pale, eyes fixed on the ruins of the barn. The same barn where it all started. The same place that represented all the pain, all the violence, all the injustice. And now it had been burned, as if Augustus wanted to erase any evidence of his crimes. "No," Thomas answered finally. "I won't fall for it, because I'm going to do something he doesn't expect." Helen turned her face to him. "What?" "I'm going to the Capitol. I'm going to find the state prosecutor. I'm going to do this the right way." "Mr. Miller, you know the prosecutor does business with the colonel too," Jeb started, but Thomas cut him off. "Dr. Olympus is a serious man. Always has been. If we get to him with proof, with testimony..." "Testimony from who?" Helen stood up, the blanket falling from her shoulders. "Mine? Do you think anyone is going to believe the word of a poor girl against a colonel? They'll say I'm lying, that I'm being manipulated by you, that I'm crazy. Then we get more proof. There have to be other victims. A man like Augustus doesn't do this just once." It was then that Helen spoke the words that changed everything. There are others." Thomas froze. "How do you know?" "Because he said so." Helen's voice shook, but she continued. "When he tied me in that barn, when he did that, he talked. Said I wasn't the first fool to fall into his hands. Said no one ever believed the others, and no one would believe me. He mentioned names. Mary, the miller's daughter, Josephine, who worked at his manor. And he said your wife had been his too." The silence that fell was absolute. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. Thomas felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Amelia. Augustus had confessed to Helen. He had bragged. He said that? Thomas's voice came out hoarse, broken. Helen nodded, tears flowing. "He said she was pretty, but weak. Said she couldn't handle the pressure. I'm so sorry, Mr. Miller. I should have told you sooner, but I was so scared." Thomas stumbled to the chair and sat down heavily. Jeb put a hand on his boss's shoulder, not knowing what to say. But it was Helen who approached, knelt in front of the rancher, and held his bandaged hands. "We can do this, Mr. Miller. We can bring them all together. I will speak, and if the others speak too, he won't have anywhere to run." Thomas looked deep into her brown eyes, and saw determination where before there was only fear. Helen was ready to face the monster, and he wasn't going to let her do it alone. Then that's what we do. We find the other women, we gather the testimonies, and we bury that bastard. In the following 2 days, the silent investigation began. Thomas and Helen went to the miller's house, an old, bent man who lived at the edge of town. When they asked about his daughter, Mary, the man went pale and slammed the door in their faces. But his wife, Mrs. Ann, came out the back door and met them on the road. Mary ran away 3 years ago, she told them, voice low, eyes full of ancient pain. It was after the colonel, after it happened. She tried to speak, but no one believed her. They said she was loose, that she had provoked it. The priest said it was her sin. The girl went mad with despair and ran away one night. Never came back. Don't even know if she's alive. Helen held the woman's hand. I believe her, because he did the same to me. Mrs. Ann's eyes went wide. You're the Carter girl? The one found in the barn? I am. And I'm going to make him pay for what he did to all of us. The woman wept, hugged Helen tightly, and before leaving whispered, Josephine is at the convent of the Carmelite sisters, in the next town over. She took refuge there after it happened to her too. The search for Josephine took Thomas and Helen to the convent of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, an old building with thick walls, 2 hours away by carriage. The Mother Superior was cold at first, but when Helen explained the reason for the visit, the elderly nun sighed heavily. Josephine speaks to no one, barely speaks to the sisters. What that man did to her broke something inside her that I don't know if God can fix. Please, begged Helen, I just need her to know she isn't alone, that there is someone who believes, that there is a chance for justice. The mother looked at the girl for long seconds, then nodded. I will call her. But if she doesn't want to talk, you leave and never come back. Understood. Josephine appeared, wearing the simple habit of a novice, a girl of maybe 25, too thin, with hollow eyes that held the same emptiness Helen recognized so well. When she saw the visitors, she wanted to run, but the mother held her gently. This young woman has something to say to you, child, something important. Helen stepped forward slowly, like someone approaching a wounded animal. My name is Helen, and Colonel Augustus Fletcher did to me the same thing he did to you. Josephine froze, her eyes filled with tears instantly. How do you know? Because I recognize it. I recognize that look, that fear, that shame that isn't ours, but we carry anyway. Helen held out her hand. And I came to say I'm going to make him pay. But I need your help. I need you to confirm what he did. I need you to be brave one more time. Josephine looked at the outstretched hand as if it were a snake. No one believed me. No one. They said I was a maid, that I invented it to get money out of him. They kicked me out of town. I wanted to die. I tried to die. If it weren't for the sisters, I know, and I'm so sorry you went through that alone. But now we are at least two, and two voices are harder to ignore than one. The Mother Superior put a hand on Josephine's shoulder. Child, you always said you wanted God to do justice. Maybe this is the answer to your prayers. Josephine stood in silence for long minutes, tears running freely. Then, with a trembling voice, she whispered, "What do I need to do?" The return to St. Anthony's Valley was tense. Helen and Thomas brought with them a letter written by Josephine, detailing what Colonel Augustus had done to her 3 years ago. The handwriting was shaky, the words loaded with pain, but it was evidence. It was concrete proof. But when they arrived at the ranch, as night fell, they found the house surrounded. 5 armed men, led by Matthew Fletcher, blocked the entrance. And in the middle of them, sitting calmly in a chair they had brought from Thomas's own house, was Colonel Augustus. Thomas pulled the carriage reins, making the horses stop at a safe distance. His hand went instinctively to the shotgun under the seat, but Helen held it. No, that's what he wants. Augustus stood up slowly, a cruel smile on his face. Thomas, my old friend, I heard you went for a little ride. Went to visit the convent, didn't you? Talking to people you shouldn't. Get off my property, Augustus. Your property? Did you know this land, this beautiful ranch, has had its deeds overdue for 2 years? And that by coincidence, the bank transferred the debt to me last week? Thomas felt his blood run cold. You're lying. Am I? Augustus pulled a paper from his pocket and waved it in the air. It's all here, Thomas. Legal, signed, stamped. Either you pay what you owe by Friday, or this ranch becomes mine. And then, well, then I'll have every right to decide who can or cannot stay on it. It was a perfect trap. Augustus had bought Thomas's debts, old debts, forgotten, but still legal, and was now using that as leverage. Either Thomas shut up, sent Helen away, and gave up seeking justice, or he lost everything. You are a monster, screamed Helen from the carriage, voice shaking with rage. A cowardly monster who uses power to destroy innocent people. Augustus turned cold eyes to her. Watch your tongue, girl. You're already in a delicate situation. Don't make it worse. Delicate? Helen climbed down from the carriage, ignoring Thomas's attempt to hold her. She walked straight toward the colonel, and there was something in her posture, a righteous fury, a dignity wounded but not broken, that made even the armed men step back. You dragged me to that barn. You tore my clothes. You tied me up. You did things I don't even have the courage to say out loud. And you still had the nerve to say no one would believe me, that I was nothing, that I was just one more. Augustus's face lost color. Shut your mouth. No, I won't shut up. You did this to Mary. You did it to Josephine. You did it to Amelia, Mr. Miller's wife. And God knows how many others. Helen's voice echoed across the property, strong and clear. You are a rapist, a criminal, and I won't let you do this to anyone else. It all happened very fast. Augustus raised his hand and slapped Helen across the face so hard she fell to the ground. Thomas roared and jumped from the carriage, but the armed men already had shotguns pointed at him. Matthew held his father by the arm. Dad, people are coming. Let's go. Indeed, on the road, several people were approaching. News of the confrontation had spread, and the curious came to see. Among them, Thomas recognized Father Eugene, Mrs. Higgins, the barber Mr. Walters, and even Sheriff Reynolds. Augustus took a deep breath, recovering his composure. He looked at Helen still on the ground, face marked by the violence of the blow, and spat at her feet. You're going to regret this, you tramp. The only one who will regret it is you, replied Helen, wiping blood from the corner of her mouth, because I'm going to tell everything, to everyone. And this time, they're going to have to listen to me. Augustus and his men mounted their horses and left, but not before the colonel shouted to the curious onlookers approaching. This girl is crazy. She's slandering a good man. You are witnesses. But something had changed. Maybe it was Helen's raw courage. Maybe it was the slap everyone had seen. Maybe it was simply that someone had finally spoken out loud, what many suspected in silence. But when Thomas helped Helen stand up, Mrs. Higgins approached and put a shawl over the girl's shoulders. I believe you, child. And then, surprisingly, Ida, Helen's mother, who had arrived running upon hearing the commotion, stepped forward and said loudly, My daughter is no liar, never was. If she says it was him, it was him. One by one, others began to murmur agreement. Not everyone. Many still looked with suspicion and judgment. But some, enough, were starting to doubt the official version. Father Eugene, ashamed, approached Thomas. "Mr. Miller, I should have believed sooner, should have helped. It's not too late to do the right thing, Father." That night, in Thomas's house, the people who decided to stand on the side of truth gathered. Mrs. Higgins, Ida, Anthony and John, Father Eugene, Mr. Walters, and surprisingly, Mrs. Mary, the cook, who revealed something no one expected. "I worked in Colonel Augustus's house 20 years ago," she told them, voice heavy. "I saw things I never had the courage to speak of. He was always like that, always thought he could do whatever he wanted with a poor woman. There was a maid, Chloe was her name, who disappeared after after. No one ever asked what happened to her." "Would you testify to that?" asked Thomas. "If it's to end him, yes, I'll testify. It was the beginning." Slowly, piece by piece, the truth was being assembled. But the most important part was still missing. Definitive proof. Something linking Augustus to the crimes irrefutably. It was Anthony who had the idea. The doctor, Dr. Cassidy. He examined Helen when she was found. He must have notes, must have seen the marks. Thomas hit the table. "That's right. And if we get the medical notes from all the victims, it will be impossible to deny." But when they went to Dr. Cassidy's house the next morning, they found the door locked and a neighbor who informed them. "The doctor left in a hurry last night. Said he had an emergency in the capital. Took his bag and all the files. Bought, threatened, or both." Augustus was erasing tracks. Helen sat on the doctor's porch step, despair threatening to return. He's going to get away with it, again, like always. But Thomas didn't give up. He had one last resource. A dangerous resource, but necessary. Amelia's letter was burned in the barn. But I know where she hid her diary. Helen looked up. Diary? Amelia wrote everything down. I only found out after she died, when I was cleaning out her things. She hid the diary in a place she thought I'd never look. He paused. In the chapel, behind the statue of the Virgin Mary. They went to the small chapel that stood on the ranch property, an old building Amelia loved. Thomas hadn't entered there since his wife's death. He couldn't bring himself to. But now, he pushed the heavy wooden door and walked in. The interior was dusty, forgotten by time. The image of the Virgin remained on the altar, staring with plaster eyes at nothing. Thomas approached with reverence, made the sign of the cross, and then, carefully, moved the statue. Behind it, in a cavity in the wall, was a leather-bound notebook, protected by waxed cloth. With trembling hands, Thomas opened it. Amelia's handwriting jumped from the pages, and it was like hearing her voice again. She had documented everything, the dates, the places, the horrible details of every time Augustus forced himself on her. And at the end, in the last entry before her death, she had written, I can no longer carry this secret. He said if I told, he would kill Thomas, would kill my family. And I believe him, because I have seen what he does to those who defy him. But the truth needs to exist somewhere, so I write here, where I know one day it will be found. Colonel Augustus Fletcher is a monster, and I hope that when this truth comes to light, he pays for everything he did not only to me, but to all the others. Because I know there are others. There are always others with men like him. May God forgive me for the cowardice of not being stronger. And may he forgive Thomas for not believing me when I tried to tell him. Thomas closed the diary, tears running freely now. Helen put a hand on his shoulder, and they stayed there, in the silence of the chapel, sharing the pain, and for the first time, real hope for justice. "We have him," whispered Helen. "We finally have him." But making justice happen would be the hardest part. Because Augustus still had power, still had money, still had armed men willing to do anything for him. And desperate men are the most dangerous. The final confrontation was coming, and St. Anthony's Valley would have to decide, once and for all, if it was going to continue allowing a monster to govern their lives, or if it was going to have the courage to face him. The answer would come sooner than everyone expected, and it would be violent. 3 days after the discovery of Amelia's diary, Thomas and Helen made the decision that would change everything. They would go to the Capitol personally, take all the evidence to the public prosecutor, and demand that justice be done. The risk didn't matter anymore. The threats didn't matter anymore. The truth needed to be told. And they would be the messengers of that truth, whatever the cost. On the morning of their departure, the house was full of people. Ida prepared a bundle with bread, cheese, and jam for the journey. Anthony and John insisted on going along, armed for protection. Mrs. Higgins blessed them with rosemary branches and holy water, muttering ancient prayers. Even Father Eugene appeared, bringing a letter signed by him, attesting to Helen's good character and witnessing the events he had seen. "You are doing the right thing," the priest said, voice choked. "And I should have done this a long time ago. May God protect you on the road." Thomas shook the priest's hand, then looked at Helen. She was dressed in a simple but dignified dress Mrs. Higgins had sewn, hair tied in a bun, face still marked by Augustus's slap. But her eyes, her eyes were different. There was no more emptiness. There was determination. There was fire. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready." They climbed into the carriage, with Anthony and John on horseback behind them. The road to the Capitol would take the whole day, and they would need to spend the night at an inn halfway there. But as the carriage began to descend the ranch's dirt road, Helen looked back one last time. She looked at the main house where she had found refuge, looked at the ruins of the barn, now covered in weeds, looked at the chapel where Amelia's secret had been kept for 15 years. "Don't be afraid," Thomas said softly, as if reading her thoughts. "We're coming back, and when we come back, it's going to be different." The journey was quiet until mid-afternoon. The road wound through the mountains, passing small villages and isolated farms. The August sun shone bright, but the cold wind from the ridge made the trip bearable. Helen even managed to relax a little, watching the landscape, remembering what it was like to be in the world without constant fear. It was when they were crossing a narrower stretch of the road, bordered by dense woods on both sides, that everything fell apart. 5 men on horseback emerged from the trees, blocking the way, all armed, all with faces covered by bandanas. But Helen recognized Matthew Fletcher's eyes immediately. Anthony and John drew their weapons, but before they could fire, shots came from the woods behind them. An ambush. More men hidden. John was hit in the shoulder and fell from his horse with a cry of pain. Anthony managed to fire once before being taken down too, not mortally wounded, but knocked out by a pistol whip to the head. Thomas tried to pull the shotgun from under the carriage seat, but Matthew was already beside him, pointing a revolver at his head. "I wouldn't do that, old man, unless you want to see your brains scattered on the road." Helen was frozen with terror, memories of that night in the barn returning with full force. It was the same feeling of helplessness, the same paralyzing fear. But then her eyes found the bundle beside her on the seat. Inside it, hidden among the clothes, lay Amelia's diary and all the documents they had gathered. In a quick movement, she grabbed the bundle and pressed it against her chest. One of the men tried to snatch it from her, but Helen bit his hand hard, making him howl and recoil. "Let go of that, bitch," Matthew screamed, getting off his horse. "Never." Helen jumped from the carriage and ran into the woods, the bundle clutched tight against her body. She heard shouts behind her, the sound of horses, but she didn't look back. She just ran. She ran like she had never run in her life, jumping over roots, dodging branches, heart exploding in her chest. Thomas tried to go after her, but Matthew struck him with the handle of the revolver, making the rancher collapse on the road. "Get the girl. Father wants those papers burned before nightfall." 3 men entered the woods on horseback, but the vegetation was dense, making pursuit difficult. Helen had the advantage of being on foot, able to pass through places the horses couldn't reach. She ran blind with desperation, lungs burning, bare feet bleeding. She had lost her shoes in the run, but she didn't stop. Finally exhausted, she hid inside the hollow trunk of a giant tree. She could hear the men passing, horses neighing, voices shouting. She stayed completely still, the bundle pressed against her chest, praying every prayer she knew. "She can't have gone far," a voice shouted. "Let's split up, search everything." Helen closed her eyes and kept praying. "Virgin Mary, protect me. Saint Lucy, hide me. Saint George, defend me." The prayers mixed with the rapid beating of her heart. How long she stayed there, she couldn't say. Could have been hours or just minutes. But eventually, the sounds of pursuit faded away. She waited until the silence was absolute, only the singing of birds and the wind in the trees. When she finally emerged from hiding, the sun was already setting. She was lost, hurt, bleeding, but she had the bundle. She had the proof. And she had to reach the capital, no matter what happened. She walked through the woods until she found a creek, drank water, washed the wounds on her feet, tore a piece of her petticoat to make makeshift bandages. Then, using the setting sun as a guide, she began to walk in the direction she thought was the capital. Night fell completely, and Helen kept walking. The full moon lit the path enough for her not to trip. Her feet hurt so much she didn't even feel them anymore. It was just a mechanical walk, one foot in front of the other, the bundle tight against her chest, determination being the only thing keeping her standing. It was when dawn was breaking that she saw lights ahead, a small village. She stumbled to the first house and knocked on the door. An elderly woman answered, scared by the apparition. Helen was covered in dirt and blood, dress torn, hair loose and full of leaves. "For the love of God, child, what happened?" I need to get to the capital," Helen managed to say, before her legs failed. The woman caught her before she fell. Joe, get here, quick!" The woman's husband appeared, and together they carried Helen inside, gave her water, cleaned her wounds, wrapped her in a blanket. But Helen wouldn't let go of the bundle. Even semi-conscious, she kept her arms firmly around it. "Have to take to prosecutor, justice," she muttered. The couple looked at each other, worried. "The girl is delirious." "No." Helen forced herself to sit up, eyes fixed on the two. "I'm not delirious. My name is Helen Carter, from St. Anthony's Valley, and inside this bundle are proofs of crimes Colonel Augustus Fletcher committed. I need to take this to the capital. I need help." Something in the intensity of her gaze, in the absolute seriousness of her voice, made old Joe nod. "All right, child. All right. But you need to rest a few hours first. Otherwise, you won't make it there." Helen slept for 3 hours, the deep sleep of complete exhaustion. When she woke up, she found clean clothes left by the lady of the house, and a package with food. Her hostess explained that Joe had gone to the neighboring village to borrow a carriage to take her to the capital. "Why are you helping me?" Helen asked, genuinely curious. "You don't even know me." The old lady smiled, a sad smile. "Because I also suffered at the hands of a powerful man, child. Not Colonel Augustus, but another just like him. And in my time, there was no one who believed, nowhere to run. So if I can help you get justice, I will help, even if it's the only thing I do right in life." Helen hugged the woman tightly, both crying together. 2 generations of pain meeting and recognizing each other. Joe returned with the carriage at noon, and they immediately left for the capital. The trip would take over 4 hours, but finally, at the end of the afternoon, the towers of the capital's cathedral appeared on the horizon. Helen had never seen the capital. It was so big, so many people, so many buildings. But Joe knew the way to the courthouse. He stopped the carriage in front of the imposing stone building and helped Helen down. "You're going to make it, child. I feel it." Helen looked at the building, took a deep breath, and walked in. Inside, everything was confusing. Hallways full of people, lawyers in suits, clerks running from one side to another. She stopped a middle-aged man and asked where the public prosecutor's office was. "Second floor, last door on the left, but you need an appointment." Helen was already climbing the stairs. When she arrived at the door of Dr. Olympus's office, the secretary tried to bar her entry. "Miss, you can't enter like this. The doctor is—" But Helen pushed the door open and entered. Inside the large office, a man of about 50, gray hair, glasses on his nose, looked surprised at the girl who had just invaded his office. "Who are you, miss, and what?" "My name is Helen Carter," she said, voice firm despite the fatigue. "And I come from St. Anthony's Valley to make a formal complaint against Colonel Augustus Fletcher for the crimes of rape, threat, attempted murder, and obstruction of justice." The prosecutor took off his glasses slowly. "Miss, those are very serious accusations." "I know." Helen placed the bundle on his desk. "And I have proof. I have statements from other victims. I have the diary of a woman he destroyed until she took her own life. I have witnesses, and I have my own story." Olympus opened the bundle and began to read. First, Amelia's diary, then Josephine's letter, then the gathered testimonies. His face grew increasingly serious, hands shaking slightly as he turned the pages. When he finished, he looked at Helen for long seconds. "Miss Carter, do you know what you are doing? Do you know the power Colonel Augustus has? He has friends everywhere, including here. I know, but the truth needs to be stronger than his power." "It needs to be." The prosecutor remained silent, clearly fighting internally. Helen saw the exact moment he made the decision. The moment he chose to do what was right, not what was politically convenient. "All right." He stood up, put all the documents in a leather folder. "I will issue an arrest warrant against Augustus Fletcher, and I will go personally to St. Anthony's Valley to arrest him. But Miss Helen, this is going to cause an earthquake. You need to be prepared." "I am prepared, and I'm not alone." Dr. Olympus picked up the telephone, one of the few that existed in the city, and began making calls. First to the state judge, then to the Capitol Police Force, organizing an operation. As he spoke, Helen sat in a chair, and for the first time in days, allowed herself to feel relief. She had done it. Against all odds, she had done it. 2 days later, a convoy of 10 officers from the Capitol, led by Prosecutor Olympus and accompanied by Helen, arrived in St. Anthony's Valley. The news had spread through the town like fire in dry grass. When the police horses and carriages entered the main street, half the population was on the sidewalks watching. Helen, sitting beside the prosecutor in the lead carriage, held her head high. She didn't look away from anyone. Not from those who judged her, nor from those who supported her. She was there to do justice, not to seek approval. The convoy went straight to Colonel Augustus's ranch. The imposing gate was locked, but the police broke it open without ceremony. Inside the main house, they found Augustus in his study, trying to burn papers in the fireplace. "Colonel Augustus Fletcher," the prosecutor said formally, "you are under arrest for the crimes of multiple rape, threat, attempted murder, and obstruction of justice." Augustus looked at Helen standing in the doorway, and his face twisted in rage. "This is a farce, a conspiracy. You will regret this." "The only one who will regret it is you," Helen replied calmly, "for the next few decades in prison." When the officers put the handcuffs on Augustus and led him outside, a crowd had gathered. And this time, instead of silence or judgment, there was applause. Timid at first, then louder and louder. It's over. The trial of Augustus Fletcher lasted 3 months and was the biggest scandal the state had seen in decades. Helen testified, as did Josephine, who came from the convent. Mrs. Mary testified. They even found Mary, who was working on a farm in another state, and returned to tell her story. Amelia's diary was read in full in court, and there wasn't a dry eye when they finished. Thomas, sitting beside Helen throughout the trial, held her hand while his dead wife's voice echoed through the room, finally being heard. Colonel Augustus Fletcher was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Matthew and his henchmen were also jailed for attempted murder and conspiracy. The colonel's properties were confiscated to pay damages to the victims, and St. Anthony's Valley slowly began to change. 6 months after the trial, on a clear February morning, Helen was on the porch of Thomas's ranch, sewing a new dress. The house had been renovated, a new barn built, not in the same place as the old one, but in another corner of the property. The chapel had been restored and was now visited regularly. Thomas approached, bringing 2 mugs of coffee, and sat beside her. They stayed there in comfortable silence, watching the sun rise over the mountains. "Have you thought about what you want to do now?" he asked after a while. Helen smiled. "I have, actually. I want to open a shelter for women who went through what I went through, a place where they can recover, where they are believed, where they get real help." Thomas looked at her with admiration. "That is a wonderful idea. And I was thinking, maybe we could use part of the ranch for that. Build some small cottages, have a community garden." She paused, nervous. "But only if you want, of course. It's your property." "Helen," Thomas placed his hand over hers. "This ranch is your home just as much as it is mine. And that idea, Amelia would love it. She would love to know that something good, something that helps other people, came out of all this pain." They sat holding hands, looking at the future they were building together. It wasn't romance. It never would be, and both knew that. It was something deeper. It was partnership. It was chosen family. It was shared healing. In town, things also changed. Mrs. Margaret apologized publicly to Helen in church. Many others who had judged did the same. Some never would, and that was okay. Helen had learned she didn't need everyone's approval to live with dignity. Josephine left the convent and went to work with Helen on the shelter project. The 2 women, united by pain but strengthened by survival, became great friends. Mary also returned eventually, and together they began to build something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. Father Eugene began preaching sermons about believing victims and not judging without knowing the truth. Sheriff Reynolds was replaced by someone more honest. Slowly, the culture of silence that protected predators began to crack. A year later, at the official inauguration of Hope House, as Helen named the shelter, half the town attended. The simple but welcoming building had 6 rooms, a communal kitchen, a sewing room where women could learn a trade, and a garden full of flowers. Helen gave a short speech that day. This house exists because brave people believed the truth when it was easier to believe the lie. It exists because a woman who died 16 years ago had the courage to write her story, even thinking it would never be read. It exists because a man decided to do the right thing, even 15 years late. And it exists because I learned that surviving isn't enough. We need to live. We need to transform pain into something that helps others. So this house is for that, for transformation, for healing, for new beginnings. Applause echoed through the property. Thomas, standing beside Helen, had tears in his eyes. Beside him, Ida wept with pride for her daughter. And that afternoon, while the sun set over St. Anthony's Valley, while women and children filled the garden of Hope House with laughter and conversation, Helen looked back one last time. She looked at the dirt road that had brought her here. She looked at the mountains that witnessed her suffering and her victory. She looked at the new barn, built over a past that would never be forgotten, but would also no longer define the future. And then she turned forward, towards the women who were arriving, seeking refuge, towards the work that needed to be done, towards the life that was just beginning. Because Helen Carter had discovered something fundamental, the truth always comes to light. It might take time, it might cost dearly, it might hurt in the process, but it comes. And when it comes, it has the power to liberate not just the one who tells it, but everyone who had the courage to believe it. The answer, as Helen learned, is that the truth doesn't win alone. It wins when brave people decide to fight for it, when they decide to believe, when they decide that silence is no longer an option. And that, in the end, is the greatest lesson of St. Anthony's Valley. That courage isn't never having fear. Courage is being afraid and doing the right thing anyway.